Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Peter Askim. I'm the artistic director of the next Festival of Emerging Artists. Super great to see all of you here. I'm really excited about tonight's workshop with Ryan Streber. So let me just tell you just very briefly about the festival and what we do and what we've been doing in the pandemic. So the next Festival of Emerging Artists is a festival that I started in 2013 to be helpful to artists at the beginning of their careers and to provide all of the different pieces of the puzzle that it takes to make a career in music and specifically new music these days. So we focus on the music of living composers and entrepreneurship and developing artistry and collaboration and interdisciplinary projects. And when the pandemic hit, almost exactly a year ago, we started doing workshops with our artists and for our artists. So we've been having great workshops all year, and then leading up to a virtual festival that we did last June. 35 plus artists, really fantastic, really inspirational. And that's what we're about, is we're here to provide resources and a sense of community and a sense of information and inspiration for all of you. So thanks for joining us. I just want to mention that we provide all of these services for free, but we pay all of our artists. And I just put in the chat our website and Ryan and Oktaven's website. And also, if you'd like to help us support artists and bring these informational sessions to you, please do make a tax-deductible donation to us. We've got really great artists coming up. Next week, we're doing 3 premieres with Ashley Bathgate of Next Festival Composers. Don't miss that. That's next Thursday. And we have a bunch of other fantastic workshops coming up. We're just about to announce our 2021 season, which is just amazing artists lined up for all of you. So stay tuned for that. We had some really great workshops with 410 Media the past few weeks, and it was great to do a deep dive into video, and tonight's a deep dive into audio. They were really excited to answer questions, and I talked to Ryan, and he's very excited to answer your questions and to make this useful for all of you. So we're all now recording experts, like it or not, and we all need all the help we can get. So without further ado, I just want to introduce Ryan Streber of Oktaven Audio, and enjoy. I'm super excited to hear everything, and I have a whole list of questions, so I hope you do too. Thanks so much. Enjoy. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me, Peter. I really am happy to be here and happy to talk to you all. Hopefully, give you some useful information, answer some questions, somewhat relevantly. I'll start by just talking a little bit about where I kind of started down the audio path, because I think in ways it's relevant to what I suspect is going to be a lot of what you guys are interested in, which is home recording and working in a more DIY kind of way on your own projects. I studied composition, and I never really formally studied audio in any way. I did some internships, but basically kind of figured it out as I went along, and certainly started off doing that by working on my own projects and working on projects at home. And back about 20 years ago now, I was finishing up my undergrad and about to leave school and trying to figure out how I could continue making music out of the context of a conservatory where I had lots of classmates and opportunities to have my music performed. And so I kind of turned towards the idea of recording things. And back then it was just the kind of beginning of, working with audio on a computer at home. And so there were definitely more tools there than there had ever been before, but it was still pretty primitive by today's standards. But I think in ways that was a good thing. It kind of forced me to work within certain limitations, but with also a lot of freedom. And, I quickly found that one of the big challenges in audio is that if you're working at home and working alone on things, it's very hard to have a reference to compare what you're doing against other kinds of work. Some of the earliest projects that I worked on myself were kind of copy projects, meaning like I would take a recording that I liked and try to recreate it somehow and try to break it apart and figure out, what made it work and what I could do to get there and where I came up short. In music, at least in classical music, even though it's to a large extent a kind of reproductive art, there's not a real tradition in the pedagogy for copying in the way that there is, say, in visual art, where artists, painters and sculptors and visual artists, copying works that exist is a huge part of what you do. In music, we don't really do that in the same way, and it was something that I found I needed to do to try to get my head around where, why I was unhappy with the things that were coming out of the speakers when I made them, whereas things that other people made sounded so great, and was it just that I didn't have the right mics or the right preamps, or was it something else, or all of the above? And so I kind of started down that path, and for better or for worse, I pretty quickly got the engineering bug and became a lot more involved in the engineering side of it than the composing creative side of it, and kind of had to find ways to feed the habit of getting gear and better gear and trying to up the game. And so I kind of found my way fairly quickly from recording my own music to recording music for friends, for colleagues. And about 10 years, well, a little less than 10 years after I started down that path, my partner, Jessica Slavin, and I opened our first studio, Oktaven Audio, kind of 1.0, which used to be over in Yonkers. And kind of went for it from there. And we've been extremely lucky to, just have worked with so many amazing artists in the New York scene over the years. Yeah, I think that over the years, some of the things that I've kind of talked to a lot of musicians about and come to really focus on when I talk to other musicians about recording and about, the do's and don'ts, so to speak. I hate to kind of come to it from a negative point of view, but I think it's useful to think about the things that you kind of build into a recording that you have to deal with, whether you like it or not. There's so much that you can fix or change or do with processing and spectral repair and, all the tools that we have at our disposal in the computer now. I've kind of seen that grow even beyond where it was when I first started out, to a place now where it sometimes feels like you can do anything. And in some ways you almost can do anything. But I think especially when you're working in a home recording environment or a less than ideal situation, and even when you're working in a studio, which in some ways tries to be an ideal situation, but, never, it's suited for certain things and maybe not as much for other things. Getting a sense of where the limitations are and what the things are built into the recording that you won't be able to change, I think is a really important kind of first step. When you make a recording, even if you're going to be doing lots of editing and lots of alteration of the sound, you are still committing in certain ways to the choices you make right at the outset. And those choices and the kinds of commitments you're making, in a way, go in order of amount of stuckness, amount of inflexibility in certain ways from the source on down the line. And they kind of are most critical at the source, meaning the instrument you play, the room you're in, just musically what you do with your voice or your instrument. And then they kind of grow lesser and lesser in importance as you go down the chain, from the microphone to the preamp to the converter to your choice of software and onward to when you get to the end of the chain. In a way, you have everything possible that you can kind of tweak. But where you start out, where you place the instrument in the room, what the room is like, how it's treated, what the room sounds like, all of that is stuff that's going to be built to some extent or other into the recording. And that's where the most critical choices, I think, come. And especially over this past year, as I've had the opportunity to work with musicians who have done recording at home, and kind of sent me things to work on or mix or master, or I've just been able to listen to things that people have made. I think the single most common problem that comes up, and I've heard some amazing sounding things that people have made at home, so I don't want to suggest that that's all that there is problematic material. But when there is a problem, most of the time it is coming from the issue of how much or how little there's a differentiation between the direct sound of the source and the sound of the room that source is in. One of the hardest things to do in audio, and no matter what technology you have, no matter how many amazing tools you have, it is still extremely difficult to remove reverb or ambient sound or room sound from a recording. At least acoustic. Obviously, we're talking about acoustic recordings that are made, of a sound in a room. Electronic music is a whole different thing. But if you're recording your voice in your bedroom or your piano in your living room, or even if you're recording your string quartet in a studio, in a recording studio that has a kind of room that's set up for recording rock drums, that's the extent to which you let the sound of that room be a part of the sound of the recording you make is something that will be pretty inflexible. You can add reverb to it, and then you're going to have the sound of that room with reverb added to it. It's not going to go away. There are de-reverb plugins that kind of do a little something, but most of the time are not super effective for especially acoustic music. They can be pretty artifacty. So I don't mean to get too specific into this one point, but I kind of dwell on it because it is so critical. And one of the things that I've seen kind of again and again people struggle with, and they don't quite know why. It's that the sound of the room and the sound of the space that you're in is such a huge part of where you're going to end up in the end, whether you like it or not. And so, thinking about recording as a series of kind of commitments from where you're starting and from the source all the way down the line is, I think, a really important place to come from. And along with that, making recording is also, you're obviously performing in some way, whether you're editing the performance or altering it in a lot of ways, that's, going to be a part of the puzzle, but there's still that starting point of the performance. And the psychology of that is also extremely important. Whether you're recording by yourself or recording in a studio with an engineer or a producer or bandmates or ensemble members. I think something that I'm hoping has happened over the last year is that classical musicians in particular have been kind of forced to go through the somewhat painful process of realizing how different you listen to yourself when you record compared to when you practice or when you perform. It's such a different headspace and such a different way of listening and way of experiencing music when you're in a recording situation. And that, I think, applies to whether you're at home or in a studio or recording on location. You just hear things differently when you know the tape is rolling and when you know you're going to be preserving that moment and revisiting it and kind of living with it. And I think that the practice of recording oneself at home is actually, I think, a very useful thing in that way, to prepare yourself for when you do go into a studio or when you do recordings in a different context. I've been amazed to see, musicians who have done very little recording come into a recording situation and find that it just is so utterly unfamiliar because it's just something that you can't really practice. And without doing it, it's just something that kind of hits you in the face when you walk in the room and start playing in a very silent room with, really sensitive microphones all around you. And then you listen back and it's suddenly like, oh, I never heard that before. I didn't know I sounded like that. So doing it at home and learning how to kind of experience that and finding a productive headspace with that is also something that I find to be a really important part of that, committing to the source of where you're starting. It's the performance as much as it is the room and the instrument. And then, of course, kind of the gear and all the recording technology that comes from that is kind of secondary, and I'll get into talking about microphones and in gear, and I'm sure that a lot of you will have questions about that stuff. And it's not to say it's not important, but the greatest microphones in the world and the most amazing gear will only be capturing and processing what happens, what they capture, and so finding ways to make that starting point as good as it can be is, I think, really that's the foundation of any recording you make. And I think that a huge part of talking about classical recording in general, and kind of specifically home classical recording, is that they're classical music and even new music recording, I think, more than most other genres, is a little bit a slave to certain kinds of conventions of what we expect certain instruments to sound like. And I think it's easy to feel like there are rules and there are right ways to do things, that this is the way you are supposed to mic a piano, and this is the microphone that you should use that's going to sound best. And that's just one example, but I think that really thinking about what you as an artist, as a performer or composer, what kinds of sounds you like, and trying to analyze that in recordings. I think that also is something that's very important. And having reference recordings, I mean, I mentioned at the top of this the idea of kind of copying recordings or analyzing them to break them down and see kind of what makes them tick. It's a little harder to do that with classical music recordings. I mean, in my case, when I did that, almost 20 years ago, I was copying pop recordings and trying to understand how mixes worked. But when you're talking about an acoustic music recording, there you have to, I think, work really hard on looking into and analyzing what makes your sound, and how that does or doesn't work with certain kinds of microphones or certain kinds of rooms. That is all part of the preparation as well. And getting into the specifics of why you like certain recordings and not other recordings, or why you like certain recordings of yourself versus other recordings that you feel don't capture your sound as well. Those are things that also you can bring into any other recording situation that you enter, whether it's a recording studio with an engineer that or you've never worked with before. I often will play back at the beginning of a session. We'll do a take or two, and then I'll have the artist listen back to what we've done and try to gauge, like, do you feel like that's your sound coming through the speakers? Or at least that's the sound that you are looking for coming through the speakers. All that stuff is so primary, and the microphones and mic placement and stuff all serve that. But it's something that you can also, I think, try to cultivate working on your own and working at home. Depending on what your circumstances are. I think you don't need to be in a studio to be able to kind of investigate that stuff. And yeah, I know there are a lot of questions, and I don't want to spend too much time just talking in abstract, because I'd love to start hearing some specifics of what people are interested in, and hopefully answering some questions. So I'd be happy to, having started off with that kind of foundation, see if there are some questions right off the bat that we can get into.
So Ryan, I'm sure there are lots of questions. Just, you had mentioned, trying to mitigate the sound of the room.
Yeah.
To get that out of. Do you have suggestions for that? I know that there's foam that you can buy, and there's also microphone things that you can attach. But what would you recommend for that?
Well, yeah. So I can definitely go into detail on that. It's a counterintuitive thing in a way, that often what makes a nice sounding or feeling room to play in can be terrible for recording in, especially in a smaller room in a home environment, or in a kind of practice room situation. Smaller rooms tend to be that much more prominent in the sound of a recording, especially if you have hard surfaces. So you mentioned foam. There's definitely, I mean, one easy way of mitigating room reflections. And so what we're talking about is basically when you're in a room, the sound you make is bouncing off of the surfaces all around you. And that sound is reverb. Usually when you use the word reverb, you're thinking of the sound of a hall or the sound of, something much more pretty. But that is a small room reverb is a type of reverb, and it's usually one that is extremely hard to get rid of if it's built into the recording. And so what I usually suggest to people is, if you're starting in a making a recording in a home situation, in a bedroom or something, and it's a pretty small room with a hardwood floor and hard walls or a hard ceiling, finding anything you can do to just soften those surfaces, whether it means putting some kind of carpet down, if you've got like kind of acoustic foam like Oralex foam or whatever. It's not ideal, but it definitely is something that just tame initial reflections. Even hanging blankets, or just putting any soft stuff around you that you can to just soften those reflections. Another really important thing is finding a good place for good microphone placement that is as close as you can get the microphone to the source without it distorting the sound of the instrument. And like what I mean by that is, often you see, if you look at, footage of a classical music recording session, or you look at a setup on a stage, and it looks like microphones are pretty far away from the instruments. That makes sense in a large space, or acoustically kind of pleasing space where you're trying to get a good balance in the microphone between the direct sound of the instrument and the sound of the room. But in a small room, you have to use the properties of especially, most of the time you're going to be dealing with directional microphones, like cardioid or other kinds of directional microphones, trying to find ways to prioritize the direct sound of the instrument over the reverberant sound of the instrument. I know that there are artists who kind of have that idea. Oh, well, someone told me that Omni Mics are better for recording classical music, so I bought a pair of Omni Mics. Omni Mics are great for recording in a hall or in a really good acoustic environment. I mean, they can be amazing also for recording much closer than you would record a, say a piano. Let's just talk about a piano, for example. Omni Mics can be useful because you can potentially get them a lot closer to the piano, and it will still maintain a more balanced presentation of the range of the piano than, say, a cardioid that's put in the same position. Whereas a cardioid, the kind of general rule of thumb is you can back it up quite a bit from the instrument, and it will have the same kind of rejection of, or same proportion of direct sound to room sound, because of how it attenuates off-axis sounds. But being aware of that is the key. If you just take an Omni Mic and put it in a place where it kind of is like, oh, well, this is what sounds good to my ear, it's very possible that what you're going to get is something that's more roomy than you want it to be, or would be ideal. I think in ways it's always a good idea to kind of start by where it sounds good to the ear, but then you have to listen to the result of the recording and mess with that. And I think that, erring on the side of deadening small rooms, it doesn't make for a pleasant place to perform. Playing in a dead room can kind of be a bummer, and make you feel very bare, and it's just the nature of the beast. That's kind of what you're a little bit stuck with. Sometimes I know it's possible to wear headphones and put some reverb in the headphones if it's really that uncomfortable. There's also the issue that so many people are doing stuff at home where they're recording with the same device that they're also using for video capture. And that can be a really problematic situation, because the placement that works for a camera is often not at all the placement that makes sense for a microphone. And if you have the same device doing both, you're kind of stuck. And there's also the issue of just like, are you stuck trying to keep your room looking nice on video, and you don't want to be like hanging, comforters and stuff all around you. So, there's a lot of, I mean, it's all, everyone's doing their best in these times to make the most of the situation. But yeah, I think that putting soft stuff around you, things that will absorb reflections. There's always the issue that, you know, it's a lot easier to absorb high frequency energy than it is to absorb low frequency. And so if you just put some acoustic foam up on a wall and you're playing upright bass, for example, your room will likely still sound pretty boomy, but you'll hear less you know, high frequency kind of reflection off of a wall. So to get into really absorbing low frequencies is a whole different can of worms, and it's not something that you can easily do without help, either from more expensive products or you know, someone who's has some more expertise in acoustic treatment. But at least, you know, to kill some of that information that is bouncing around the room, and the stuff that humans are kind of most sensitive to, which is higher or, you know, mid-frequency, mid-range stuff, you know, in the like 1K to 3K area, like consonants, you know, in a voice, or that stuff you can pretty easily tame with just average soft materials that you can kind of put up around you and under you, and even you know, above you if you're able to fix something to the ceiling. I've also helped people kind of set up very effective and not very expensive kind of DIY acoustic panels. In fact, you can see one right behind my head, that gray panel back there. I've made just dozens and dozens of them and put them all around my studio, and they're just basically 2-inch thick fiberglass boards. They are made by a bunch of different manufacturers, and all you have to do is make a simple kind of frame that you can hang them with picture wire, cover them in fabric, so you don't have raw fiberglass hanging around, because that's not a very nice thing. And there are, you know, those, you know, that's something that's not an esoteric or expensive material, and it's pretty easy to find online and order and put together with you know, very little effort. So, you know, if you're willing to kind of go down that road and make some purpose-built stuff to treat your room, and honestly, it's a good thing to do, even if you're using it for a you know, for a practice room, but certainly for recording, it can just make a huge difference. And what you're really looking to do is, I should have said this earlier, but I think the key here is you're looking to make the sound of the source the focus, and to deprioritize the sound of the room and kind of decorrelate the two. If you think of it from in visual terms, it's kind of like eh, you know, if you if you think of the portrait mode on the iPhone, where, you know, it does this very nice thing of giving you very shallow depth of field and making the subject look very in focus, and then everything else around it really blurry, and it just immediately draws you into the subject and gives it this nice kind of you feel like you're engaging directly with the subject and there's no distractions. That's kind of what we're trying to do with audio. In most recordings, especially classical music recordings that you listen to, you can usually tell, if you pay attention, that the sound of the reverb, even recordings that have a lot of reverb, the sound of the reverb is usually not competing with the sound of the source. And when I say source, I mean whatever is the music making, you know, subject, whether it's an orchestra or a singer or a guitar or whatever instrument we're talking about. And there's a very useful concept to keep in mind, which is the idea of what's called the critical distance in recording, and that's the distance. That's the point in microphone placement where basically the direct sound of the source stops being stops being kind of prioritized in the capture, and it starts to be taken over by the sound of the room. And as you get further and further the way, the reverberant sound or the indirect sound coming off of the walls of the space becomes more prioritized versus the direct sound. You never, and it's in a small room, as you can imagine, you don't have to get very far away from the source for that indirect sound to kind of swamp the direct sound. And what happens when you do that is, you know, then no matter what kind of reverb you try to add or what EQ you apply or compression or anything you do to the sound, you're applying it more to the sound of the room than you are to the sound of the instrument. So that's, you know, if you want to take a recording you made in a bedroom or in a studio, in a, you know, in any kind of a smaller room, and try to make it sound like it's in a hall, by adding reverb to it, the only way to effectively do that is you can start with a sound that sounds like it's kind of in a neutral space. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, yeah, this is super. And just so you know, the chat is exploding.
Okay, I haven't been looking at it. So
No, that's okay. That's why
bring it
I'm
on.
watching it. But everybody wants to know. Here's, inquiring minds want to know. So,
And it's I'll say, with all of this stuff, I apologize a little bit if I'm getting too specific on certain points, but it's kind of hard to not go down some of these rabbit holes because it's, but I hope, if I'm
I don't think so. But
getting sidetracked at all, just pull me back in.
no, I don't think so at all. But what do I know? I think it's all really great information. I can read from the chat, or if you can read from the chat, either way. But going back to the first one we got in was any mixing tips and tricks for blending acoustic instruments when everyone is multi-tracking in different spaces. Yeah, this is a big one.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, this is, everything I've been talking about, the source and room sound is a huge factor in this. I've done a few projects since March of 2020 where it's exactly that. It's, everyone recording in their own space and then you're kind of blending it all together. And those projects have always been pretty effortless when the source recordings are very dry and you can't really tell what kind of room they're in. They're very close mic'd. And it's funny because so much of the kind of popular wisdom around classical music recording is that, close miking is a kind of specific aesthetic and it doesn't really work. It's kind of aggressive or it's kind of in your face or it's edgy or whatever, but that's not a problem necessarily if you're then able to take that very close sound and virtually push it farther away by using reverb and using other kinds of processing to kind of virtually make it sound farther away. And I think that for working with recordings that were, multi-track situations where everyone has recorded themselves, I think the first thing to do is to try to find a common virtual space that you can put everyone in, whether that's finding a reverb that you like, basically choosing, okay, what is the imaginary venue that we want this event to happen in? What do we want? Do we want it to sound like it's in, a practice room, or do we want it to sound like it's in a huge church? And then starting from there, see how you can blend in reverbs that you like, or get balances and use EQ and other things to kind of shape the sound, to get that sense of proximity. Things like panning are all important here, and getting a sense of the kind of virtual stage you're wanting to look at. And I mean, as I'm saying all of this stuff, I'm in my mind going over all the ways in which, these concepts apply to some recordings and they don't at all apply to others. I mean, there's all kinds of, things to be said about making a recording that doesn't adhere to the laws of bodies in space. And, of course the sky's the limit, and you can make things where things are panning all over the place. And, one instrument sounds like it's 100 feet away and the other one sounds like it's, right next to your head. But if you're going for a kind of naturalistic sound of an ensemble on a stage, or sound of a group that's in the room with the listener, then I think the first important thing, because it's just the thing that and I'll just say this again and again, it's the thing that you can't really change easily, is to try to start with source recordings where there's neutral and is clear and source oriented as possible. And as soon as you start to have to deal with, okay, the guitar sounds really clear and close and dry, but I can hear on the flute that there's just a ton of kind of bathroom sounding reverb coming from the iPhone recording, then that's your lowest common denominator. Not to say that the flute itself might sound great, and the recording might be really nice and the performance might be amazing, but you're a little bit stuck with that sound, and you have to then find ways to work with that. Assuming that that's not your main problem and that you're not kind of stuck dealing with roomy sounds, I think then it's just a matter of deciding what you're going for. If it's more of a naturalistic acoustic ensemble kind of event, then like I said, finding a main reverb that really works and trying to blend everyone into that main reverb in a way that ties them together. And yeah, and then EQ is useful. I think especially something that I find really useful for recordings that are made with not necessarily amazing microphones, is high and low pass filters. Actually, low pass filters can be very, very useful. They can be useful for, without having to darken a recording too much, just taking a little bit of the high frequency detail that might not be desired, and also you wouldn't hear were you just a few feet further away from the source. So for example, say like you have a recording of a flute that was made with a large diaphragm condenser mic that someone has at home, or like a USB mic or something. You know, those are, a microphone like that is probably going to be designed for recording a voice up close and sounding really, really clear and present. But it might be giving you a lot of high frequency detail that isn't necessarily desirable in an instrument like the flute. And it's also high frequency detail that you wouldn't hear if the flute was 10 feet away from you in a bigger space. So low pass filtering, that just, you know, cutting off some of that highest frequency stuff that would naturally disappear in the air with a little bit of distance, can be a nice way to kind of virtually push something a little bit farther away in conjunction with reverb, without having to just like completely turn down all the high frequencies and make it sound too dull. And the nice thing is, with any modern DAW, you know, you usually have stock plugins that have very flexible EQ and filter sets. And so that's something that you can call upon. And by the same token, high pass filtering is also really useful just to get rid of things like rumble. You know, I haven't even touched upon the issue of ambient noise that is kind of the norm in most, even, you know, often in studio environments, but certainly in home environments. And so, you know, high pass filtering is, you know, a kind of just basic way to clear up some things. And so, you know, you're just like looking to kind of take each source and give it its footprint in whatever virtual space you want to make, and then kind of carve that out. So I know that, you know, this is, every situation is going to be different, but hopefully that's kind of, you know, helpful starting point for something like that.
That's
Also,
great.
I will say too, I mean, again, with recordings where everyone's recorded themselves at home, something I've found is that a lot of the time, if you're dealing with cell phone recordings or like Zoom recorders, or a lot of the kind of common, like I said, USB mics that people have, you know, that high frequency issue is not just a specific frequency thing, that it doesn't necessarily go away with just low pass filtering or EQing. It can also be something that's inherent in just the quality of the microphone. And I found that there are also some plugins that can be a little dangerous if you overuse them, but that can be very useful. One of the most common ones that I use and I hear other people using is a plugin called Soothe, which is kind of I honestly don't really know. It's kind of a dynamic EQ that is doing things that I don't totally understand, but it has a way of quasi magically, you know, cleaning up some nastiness in a way that doesn't hit the music too hard if you use it judiciously. So that's a useful specific tool that can kind of do a decent job of spiffing up stuff that's, you know, less than ideal. Soothe 2, I think, is the current version of the plugin. But anyway, yeah.
Great. So what gear should you invest in first if you're starting from scratch? Monitors, microphones, headphones, preamps, mixers, etc.
Yep. So it's a great question. And, you know, I'll go back to kind of what I said at the top of this question of order of importance, starting from the source and going down the chain. There's an argument that could be made that the monitors you're listening on are just as important as, you know, the microphones you're using to capture. And I think that's true, but I think the problem is that the monitors you're using are only as good as the room you're listening in. And especially if you're recording in the same room that you're listening in, then you're going to be kind of fighting the same problems on both sides if that room isn't as ideal as possible. So for that reason, good headphones, I think, are a really useful thing to have. And even if you're doing a lot of monitoring on like studio monitors or on speakers, having, you know, decent studio headphones just to kind of check things on, that can be very, very helpful. And again, you know, I'm, you know, going back to this issue of, or this idea of kind of copying existing recordings, also referencing existing recordings a lot. You know, making a recording and then use the headphones that you use to record or to make your mixes on, checking other mixes, checking music that you've known for a long time and you know you like the sound of, and then actually comparing what you make to it. It can be brutal and it can be really, really hard. And, you can't necessarily expect that what you make at home is going to right off the bat sound the way that, stuff that is, was made with resources far, far greater sounds. But I do think that headphones would be my go-to if you're not in a situation where you can have a really nicely treated listening environment. So that kind of gets that side of the chain out of the way, kind of the far end of the chain where you're monitoring. Beyond that, I think microphones, absolutely. I think that in modern day and age, the quality of the average preamp and converter that's built into most, the ubiquitous Scarlett interface or most USB interfaces, it's not the most amazing thing out there, but I think if you're getting bad sounds, it's probably not going to be the fault of the preamp or converter that you have on a standard USB interface in 2021. I think that, good microphones, and not just good microphones, but microphones that are suited to your taste. What I was saying about figuring out what kind of sound you're trying to make and what is your sound. Finding a microphone that is suited to capturing that is really important. I often recommend to people, messing with ribbon microphones for acoustic music. Ribbon microphones can have their own real problems when it comes to recording in a small room. But at the same time, they can also be pretty magical compared to, recording with like a USB mic or a cell phone. And it's because of that issue of high frequency emphasis. A lot of microphones, and a lot of condenser microphones, and even nice kind of kind of beginning professional level microphones like AKG, 414s and 214s. I'm going to get up my model numbers wrong, but microphones like that, like they're good solid microphones, but they are probably going to be fairly bright and fairly have a tendency to emphasize high frequency detail and presence for various reasons. And that can be great if that's what you're going for. But if you're, say, a string player and you're looking to kind of capture a sound that you would recognize as more what you want an audience in a hall to hear, you're probably not going to like the sound that like a DPA, for example, or an AKG 414 or, other kinds of condenser microphones tend to present, whereas something like a ribbon microphone that may be a bit darker and smoother can be really nice and much more flattering when you have to put the mic really close in order to mitigate the room that you're in. But it's a very big and deep subject, and I think it was when I started to get into and knowledgeable about and excited about microphones that my life took the turn that it took, and I wound up doing this for a living because it's kind of endless. I mean, so it's a deep dark hole you can go down, kind of getting into and exploring and learning about microphones. But I think that is far and away the most important thing after dealing with your room, dealing with your own sound and your instrument, and being musically prepared to capture what you're trying to capture. I think having a microphone that does the job is to me, it's kind of that is the easy answer to that question.
Great. Do you have any tools or resources that are helpful for a little bit of self-education in recording, like a 101 intro to DAWs, intro to mics, intro to recording techniques, intro to mixing, etc.?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a better contemporary answer for you. I can answer a little obliquely and say that I have in the last few months started to belatedly try to educate myself more about video production and video editing. And I've been kind of amazed by how many resources there are between YouTube videos and, sites like Skillshare and other kinds of just online tutorials. I haven't, because I haven't done an equivalent thing in the audio world for such a long time. I don't have great suggestions for that. What I would say is doing it. There's no better teacher than experience and just getting your hands dirty and, doing things like trying to copy an existing recording and seeing what happens and learning what kinds of things you like in the process. I learned early on that I kind of liked editing, and got excited by what I was able to do with it, and that led me to do it more and more and experiment more. And I think that's something that I wouldn't have learned without just trying it, and figuring it out. But yeah, I mean, I would love to have a more specific, like, oh, go to this website and check this out. There are lots of forums, engineering forums, and I think they can be useful to a point, although they often are very, very gear oriented. And I think that that's a dangerous thing. I think it's very easy to get sucked into the idea that, someone online says you need this kind of preamp to record. And there's so many jokes by this point between engineers about, what's the ideal microphone to record, some ultra specific thing that, no one has ever heard of before. And, you can get wrapped into that and think that, oh, if I don't have this preamp, then I can't possibly make a good sounding recording. And that's kind of nonsense. I think that, it's all about what you do with the tools that you've got and what where your ears lead you. So I think, yeah, some combination of just, kind of what's available online. And, the nice thing too is that the tools that are available for free or for very little money are amazing. I mean, frankly, programs like Reaper, I don't really use it a lot myself, but it's an incredibly deep program. And on the audio video side too, a program like DaVinci Resolve and Fairlight, like those are free programs that can just do crazy, crazy amounts of stuff if you spend the time to learn them and dig into their possibilities. So, doing tutorials and also just trying to, yeah, just learn, make mistakes, kind of let things get messy and then find your way out of problems. And there's no better way to learn than that.
Great. So another question. Our local recording studio's A room doesn't do a lot of justice to solo strings. Any tips for how to make it sound richer, warmer with a space limitation or even in software?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I mean, I've been focusing so much on home recording, but the reality is that recording studios, and this is coming from someone who makes a living primarily recording classical music in a recording studio environment, that's not always the ideal thing, and we do our best to make it work, but especially in smaller rooms. I think a lot of recording studios, especially those that are geared more towards recording, kind of drums or rock or pop or indie or even jazz stuff, they set up relatively small but very live rooms, and with a lot of room treatment that's geared towards kind of making very lively kind of big sounds in that room. And that can lead to exactly the problems that I was talking about with overly roomy sounds when you're recording something like chamber music. The thing that I've found to help with that is to go against what seems to be a lot of the popular wisdom that you have to have distant mics, and just get the mics close, but try to use mics that aren't going to sound crappy and harsh when you're up close. And I mean, the main thing I would say is ribbon microphones. I mean, on most sessions that I do in my room, I'm using ribbon mics at least on a couple instruments. And that can mean, in my case, I use a lot of Coles 4038s, RCA 44s, Royer 121s. I have a newer pair by this company, Extinct Audio. These mics, BM9s are the model numbers, and they're just terrific ribbon mics that aren't crazy expensive. But there are also just an insane number of really affordable ribbon mics that are out there now. The big problem with ribbon mics, of course, it can also be an advantage depending on the situation, but they tend to be, with a few exceptions, ribbon mics are usually figure eight, and so they're going to pick up what's in front of them and what's behind them with equal sensitivity. So you have to be just mindful of placement and how you angle them to try to, not have the back of the microphone facing a reflective surface if you can help it. So that's the thing. They're going to tend to pick up more room than a cardioid. There are some cardioid ribbon mics. They're not cheap, but they can be great. Like Beyer M160 is kind of a classic. Hypercardioid ribbon mic that's really useful for certain things. And there are also, I've never really used them, but there are things like the kind of I forget what they're called, reflection shields that people use more for like vocal recording in small spaces. But in theory, you could put those behind ribbon microphones. It might screw up sight lines, but that you have options. But I would say erring on the side of recording close. that being said, the worst thing that when I've gotten projects to mix that were recorded elsewhere, there's two things that are more problematic than any other. One is to get a recording where the mics are too roomy and too distant. The other is to get a recording where you only have close mics and no actual ensemble pickup. Even if the room isn't amazing sounding, I think having some kind of preferably stereo array or stereo pair or just a stereo mic capturing what the actual blend of the instruments in the room is as a reference, or even something that just blends slightly into the mix to tie things together, is really important. And sometimes it's only just as a reference to like, okay, what do they actually sound like in the room? Now let me try to use the close mics to match that or approximate that. But if you're just dealing with a bunch of close mics and the bleed from one mic to another, and that's all you have, that's almost worse than the situation of everyone recording themselves in their own home and send you the tracks to mix together, because the only ensemble sound you get is just the sound of each other kind of faintly in the close mics, but not actually really in a representative way. And so, yeah, I think that having some kind of a, what I tend to do in a really small room is I'll have close mics that are really pretty close and have an ensemble pair that is as close as I can get to the ensemble without it having certain instruments be louder than others, and with the balance still being decent within the group. Sometimes, like for a string quartet, for example, that means using directional mics either like right overhead or kind of right at the edge of the group, pointing kind of towards the back, and trying to find ways to minimize the room sound but still capturing the sound of the group. But yeah, it's doable. I think you have to go against a little bit what your expectation might be of where it seems like the microphone would be a good placement for the microphones, and go closer, but hopefully use microphones that don't fall apart when they're close. you know.
And that this touches a little bit on the next question too. So, do you make mixing decisions before going to tape, or having a mix from what is on tape? What is your thinking about ensemble mixes? Do you close mic everything, or let the instruments blend acoustically?
So starting at the end of that question, both. I close mic in almost any recording setup. I'm close micing and having some kind of an ensemble. The only time that ensemble mics don't come into play is in recording sessions. Usually they're jazz sessions where people are isolated. Although in the pandemic era, I've done many more sessions of straight chamber music than I ever thought I would, where people are isolated for safety reasons. And so, you'll have a wind instrument in a booth, a string player in the live room, and a percussionist in the other booth. And there's no possibility of having an ensemble pickup because everyone's separate. But that goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about how it's in ways easier to record everyone or to mix everyone when they're isolated than having just close mics. At least for chamber music, that can be different for certain kinds of things. As far as making mixing decisions, I try usually to print ref mixes during the session, like in real time, that I hope will sound good enough for the performer to go take them home, listen to that night, and feel like they're listening to a decent approximation of a final record. And they can be psyched about how it sounds and not be like, oh, well, it'll sound okay when it's mixed. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be room to make things better when you can put in the detail time and work that comes at mixing. But I like the sound that people hear on playback in the control room or in their headphones or when they listen to the kind of dailies at night, for that to be something that is like, yeah, that sounds kind of like what we're going for. So to that end, yeah, I mean, I think, I'm thinking about what I think is a good balance and a good kind of reverb setting and, decisions that I might want to make in mixing, especially working on an analog mixing console. For me, that encourages committing to things like EQ and committing to outboard processing, like some compression or filtering or other kinds of things on the way to tape. And I've done that more and more over the years as I've, kind of gotten a little more experienced. I've tried to do stuff where I'm committing to it right at the front end and building it into the recording. Sometimes it's better to leave, there's certain things that you have to leave to later. We do a lot of electroacoustic pieces where we know where there's going to be processing done after the fact, or tape parts laid in, and that just doesn't exist when you're doing the session. And so with that, without having those elements, you have to kind of delay some decisions until later in the process. But that's kind of a specific case.
So I heard that condenser mics pick up more of the room sound, so maybe good to avoid at home.
Not necessarily. Condenser mics come in all kinds of pickup patterns. There are omnidirectional condenser mics. For that matter, there are omnidirectional dynamic mics as well. I think probably the reason that there's the perception that that's the case is because condenser microphones tend to be more sensitive and have a higher output. And so if you go from, say, a Shure SM57 and unplug that and plug in, let's say, a Rode NT5 into the same preamp and turn phantom power on and listen back, the output of the Rode is going to be quite a bit louder and it's going to be more sensitive. And so you're going to hear more detail and more roominess. And also the pickup pattern of the Rode is a bit wider. So in that case, yeah, in effect, the Rode as a condenser microphone would pick up more roominess than something like an SM57. But, there are other factors. You can get a condenser microphone that's a hypercardioid pattern. A kind of higher end example would be like a Schoeps MK41 or whatever variety of Schoeps amp with an MK41 capsule on it. That is designed to minimize off-axis sound, as opposed to like an omnidirectional Schoeps capsule, which is going to evenly pick up in all directions. So it's not just the nature of it being a condenser microphone; it's about the pickup pattern. There are, as I said, dynamic omnidirectional microphones that can actually be really cool and useful for certain things. They're a lot rarer than condenser omnidirectional microphones, but they're out there. So condenser just is the type of it's the type of technology that is at work in the capsule and how the signal is transduced by the capsule and amplified by the amplifier. And because it's an active circuit, usually it tends to be a lot more sensitive and have higher output. So I think it gives that impression of being more, picking up more than another mic, but it's not totally that simple.
And just for those of you at home watching the chat, people are dropping in some really handy links. So feel free to get those. And if you are not familiar with Zoom, you can actually save the chat on your own. If you want to go down to the chat in the lower right-hand corner, there's 3 little dots. If you click on that, it'll give you the option to save the chat so that you can take all those links home and play with them for years to come. Any suggestions for dealing with Windows?
I was just looking over at that question, and that's a really great one. Windows are problematic. There are days when I would, wish I could win the lottery and have Windows in my studio because we don't have any here. But at the same time, there's a reason we don't. Windows tend to let a lot more noise in than solid walls, and they obviously are reflective surfaces that are are going to play into the problematic of room sound. An easy answer is to just cover them in the same way you'd cover a wall. Covering a window with something like a blanket or something, it's not really going to cut out outside noise very effectively. It might do a little bit, but if you're getting outside noise coming in through windows, there's only so much you can do, unfortunately. It's just, without doing some more serious construction, you're a little bit stuck with it. But you can obviously, those are kind of 2 separate problems. The issue of outside noise coming in is one, and that's pretty hard to deal with. But the issue of dealing with reflections coming off of them is maybe a little easier because you can put something soft in front of them. And then I also see from Adam that you have the question, kind of separate question about close miking cello. And yeah, using a DPA, I don't know what a Bartlett mic is, but I certainly know DPAs well. DPAs are, they're really designed for live amplification, and they're designed to maximize the sound of the instrument as naturally as they can without having too much feedback. And they're certainly generally speaking, a lot nicer sounding than like an average kind of pickup or contact mic or something like that. And I've definitely done sessions where we use a DPA for a certain kind of thing, whether it's extra isolation or some pieces, especially contemporary pieces, call for live processing and need like a very, very direct sound from the instrument. There are obviously, it's not the worst option in the world, but I would, if I were to make a solo cello recording, I would hope that I had something in addition to a DPA, just because it's such a close kind of aggressive sound on its own. And you can do things with placing a DPA that might help. And then again, you can also kind of EQ it and stuff. But because the mic tends to be right at the bridge, you're going to get a very kind of bright and somewhat gritty textured sound. If that's what you're going for, then it can be super cool, but it is a little bit inherent in the design. They're not made as like solo recording microphones. They're made more for live sound. So yeah, I mean, I try to, when I've done things that involve DPA, I've tried to complement them with something else, maybe in a different location that can kind of fill in other parts of the sound that you might be missing by the real magnifying glass that is something like a DPA. But for what they are, they're great, and I think there's no better kind of onboard microphone system than what the DPAs do. So I don't mean to sound like I'm knocking them at all, but
Great. Along those same lines with cello, you mentioned it can be helpful to have the mic close to you. Would you recommend a couple mics in the room, maybe a DPA and a Zoom recorder, or would it be better to use only one?
Yeah. So I mean, look, one thing that I think could be very, very helpful is if say you're in a scenario where you need to do like a video and you have a DPA and you have like a kind of combo video audio recorder thing. I think absolutely being able to blend the DPA into the sound of the fixed camera microphone, which could also be an iPhone, obviously. That could be hugely beneficial just to have a closer sound that you can balance in and therefore bring down the level of that distant mic a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I think that anytime you can complement something like a Zoom with something that you can get in a more ideal position, I think can be really helpful. And yeah, at that point, it's just a matter of experimenting and finding, what works placement wise and what works balance wise, because there's just so many variables there. Yeah.
What are your favorite studio monitor headphones?
So I've been using for the last 6 or 7 years now a pair of Barefoot MM45s, which I really like. These headphones I have on, I've been really loving, which are Audeze LCDXs, which the good people at Audeze were very nice to send me to check out, and I've been enjoying them greatly. But I also, and a whole other subject as far as headphones go are open versus closed headphones. And before I got the Audezes, I had been using for years Sennheiser HD 600s, which are also really great, really neutral open headphones, but they're problematic if you're in a noisy environment. So for closed headphones, which are maybe going to be a little more flexible, there are it's overwhelming how many options there are out there, but some of the kind of usual suspects that I see a lot of people using and that I've used and liked would be the Audio-Technica ATH M50s. There's also a number like Sennheiser, like HD2, oh my gosh, HD280s, I think are the, they're not esoteric or crazy expensive, but they're solid and, gonna do the job well. A lot of people love the Sony 7506s. They've been around for decades and, they're a very known quantity. So some of that is just going to be personal preference and finding what fits your head nicely and is comfortable to wear and that you feel like you can use for long hours and not get tired by. Headphones are, it's always good to advocate for not listening at crazy volumes with headphones. And also something that's good to be aware of, especially if you're playing an instrument, if you're recording with an instrument that is intonation variable, whether that's your voice or a string instrument or a wind instrument, and doing it with closed headphones, it's very good to be aware that closed headphones can pretty significantly distort your sense of pitch. And so it's really useful to do a lot of listening back and checking, and maybe checking on speakers for pitch, because I've had plenty of situations where people only listened on closed headphones, and especially only listened at kind of higher volumes, and then listened back in a different situation and found that everything they recorded was much more out of tune than they realized it was, and they just didn't know, because it sounds that pitch perception is kind of distorted by the nature of closed headphones. So
Interesting. By the way, this is great.
I hope I hope I'm not either being too vague or too specific, but
no, I think it's great. With some modern contemporary ensembles, or a combination of traditional instruments and computer generated sound, how do you blend these totally different elements?
I've got to say, I found that most of the time, if the piece makes sense of the sounds, then my job is pretty easy. I don't mean to kind of punt on that question, but it's really true. And I mean, this goes back to that whole question of the kind of order of importance from the source on down the line. Like, the vast majority of my mixing work is done by the composers who write the pieces. If the pieces are well orchestrated and balanced nicely, and they sound, reasonable, like when the piece is performed live, then 99 times out of 10, it's going to be pretty effortless to record and mix them. If a piece is calling for balances or acoustic kind of combinations, and when I say acoustic, I mean, say if it were live, it would be electronic sounds coming through loudspeakers and then acoustic instruments or amplified instruments. Things can obviously get a lot harder. And one thing I found that's kind of a pitfall is a tendency for composers to write pieces for amplified instruments and electronics, thinking that just by having a microphone on the instrument, they can suddenly kind of defy the laws of physics. Even a microphone in a live context on, say, a violin is going to have its limitations for what it can do in competition with a very loud electronically generated sound. So I think, no matter how kind of far away the piece is getting from a naturalistic, possible presentation, I still think that, that a lot of it comes down to how well the piece is conceived and, balances itself internally. It's, I'm trying to think of situations where that specific thing has really been a problem. And honestly, surprisingly, it's just usually not a big deal, because the piece is conceived with those kinds of combinations in mind. So yeah, I would love to give you an example. Oh, this one time I did this piece where we were just going crazy trying to make, the electronics blend in with the acoustic instruments. But in ways, often actually, it's kind of, those are some of the most fun mixing projects, because you're dealing with, sounds that are so original and new to the piece that, you can kind of do things and create new, you can kind of define the sound of the piece a little more specifically and not feel bound by some of the more conventional expectations of what a given ensemble sounds like. And I guess the only other thing I'd say as a generality is that, often with pieces that have electronics, you wind up using more of a close mic sound. Not always, but that tends to often be the case, because often electronic sounds can sound very close. They're not existing in an acoustic environment. They're existing kind of, in a studio situation, we tend to record the electronics direct, meaning it's not like we're amplifying them in the space with the performers. The performers are playing, the electronic sounds are being recorded directly to a track. And, either the musicians in the studio are wearing headphones and hearing the electronics via headphones, or they're just not hearing the electronics at all, and they're going to get laid in later. So you can easily wind up with a situation where the electronics sound super, super close, especially if they're more dry electronic sounds, and the instruments can sound a little bit distant. And so you wind up leaning a little more on close mics to get the sense of proximity of the various elements to not be too out of whack. But that's really the only thing I would say is a general thing that I found.
So is there a preferred headphone choice for singers?
For singers, yeah, I mean, I, well, there's a few issues, and it gets a little bit into what kind of recording you're doing. I would say that in ideal circumstances, open headphones are probably going to be the most comfortable and the most natural because they're more acoustically transparent, and so you can just hear yourself better through them. But the problem with open headphones is that if you're doing any kind of multi-tracking or doing anything with click, then the bleed from the headphones will very likely get into the microphone, and then you're going to be dealing with that. So closed headphones make it easier by attenuating the sound that escapes the headphones better. But the trade-off is that you're then kind of stuck with some of the problems that come with closed headphones. Like I said, pitch perception is distorted, and especially people who aren't really used to singing in headphones can feel very disoriented by them. So I think it really is a personal thing. I mean, they're the usual suspect, like closed studio headphones. One thing that I found doesn't work particularly well, some people bring to the studio like noise reducing headphones or other kinds of like headphones that are made more just for like consumer music listening, Bose or Beats or those kinds of things, and they can be really fun to listen on, but they can do things to the audio that can pretty intensely mess with what it actually sounds like. And if you're hearing yourself in real time coming through something that is kind of doing its own thing to the audio, that can just further kind of pull you out of what's actually happening. So I would say going with kind of tried and true, just studio monitor headphones. Like I said, not everyone loves them, but they're kind of a industry standard. The Sony 7506s or Sennheiser's Beyerdynamic makes a lot of great models of headphones. So, those kinds of things that are made as studio headphones. There are also a lot of performers who do who tour and have their own in-ears. And if you're used to that, that can also be really useful as long as bleed isn't a problem. They can be people. I know musicians who have in-ears that are molded to their ear, and they've spent hours and hours performing live in them, and so that can be comfortable. But it's such a personal thing. It's just, it might come down to just trying out different things and finding what works for you.
So I have a question, which is, what are some strategies for thinking about editing, kind of both from the whole process, from like when keeping track of takes to like actually doing the edit to not going crazy listening to the worst thing you've ever played over and over and again.
Oh man, it's so hard. Well, I mean, one thing I'll say is that I've been on projects where a lot of the projects that we work on here at Oktaven, the artist or the composer will be the one kind of doing the edit mapping and listening to takes and making selections. And then there are lots of projects where the artist wants either me or another outside kind of third-party producer to do that work, and I totally understand why, because it for some people it's just like excruciating to go through the process of listening to every take and weeding through it all. I think documentation is important, some minimum amount of just keeping track of what material is covered and what takes, keeping sessions organized and takes organized. I mean, that seems really basic, but I've been amazed, seeing sessions that were done elsewhere where it's just like, you get 1 3-hour long piece of audio, with just like, 60 takes kind of somewhere in there, and you have to just wade through it all and figure out where it is. I think for me, at least, keeping things very discreet, labeled really clearly, just that kind of bit of organizational help is key. And then, it depends on how the session goes. Some people really like to do like, the way they actually structure the session. They like to kind of start and end with run throughs and then do detailed work in the middle. And, in sessions where that kind of process works, it can be really helpful to start with the runs, and then kind of work inward from there. So at least you're starting with a larger musical context and not starting with lots of little pieces and trying to figure out how the puzzle goes together. It can also be helpful if you're finding yourself just like lost in a sea of takes, starting with last takes of things and working backwards. Often you leave something alone when you feel like you've gotten it gotten it down. And, often that's the last time you do it. So it can be good to start there and kind of work your way backward for any given segment of music. But, again, it's always different for different things. If you're working at home and working alone, that can be challenging because you're not bouncing ideas off of people or getting responses to things. And also it can be very easy when you're working by yourself to kind of neglect the organizational aspect of it, because it's like, well, it's just me. I don't need to keep notes on takes that I'm doing, but it actually can be very helpful to keep that level of organization happening. Because, very quickly you'll find if you've got even 10 takes of something, be like, okay, which one was the one that I, did like this phrase in, but didn't like that thing. And then, when you're in the moment, it, maybe just jot down a little note to yourself, to keep a little cheat sheet going that will then jog your memory as you work back through things. That can all save a lot of time. Another thing I'll say is that, now that, a lot of people have for better or for worse kind of gotten handy with using various DAWs. It used to be the norm that I would send out ref mixes at the end of a session, a bunch of stereo files like MP3s or WAV files, and people would listen in iTunes and make notes and send me a marked up score. That process can be pretty cumbersome. Whereas if you're able to just bring everything into some kind of editor and hop around, mock up things by kind of copying and pasting things into a sequence and hearing roughly how they flow together, that can certainly be helpful as well, versus just like having to skip with like, the cursor in, some playback program. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to ask you if you recommended that, just kind of stacking everything vertically and auditioning in different ways, or how to use a DAW, maybe the best.
Yeah, I have my way of doing it. And again, it depends a little bit on the session. Typical classical sessions, I tend to treat the timeline as like one continuous like repeat length of tape. And so everything is laid out horizontally, from start to finish with markers. And then I can kind of skip around using keyboard shortcuts to find the take I'm looking for based on the memory location. And I personally try to keep things very organized by keeping the file numbers that are auto-created when you start a new take. Like when you start recording, I use Pro Tools. So in Pro Tools, you press record, it generates a new set of regions. And when you press stop, those regions will all have a number based on how many you've done before. So the first time you hit record and stop, those are all number 1. The second time you hit record and stop, those are all number 2. I try to always start and then stop transport for every slated take, so that, when I hit record and say take 1, we do take 1, I stop, hit record, say take 2, those now all say I'll have the number 2 in them, and so on and so forth. So that even when I put an edit together, I can look at the various regions in the edit and know exactly what take I'm using just visually by looking at the file names that are built in. Because that's something that becomes a real headache if you're, again, it's, different engineers and different people have their ways of doing things, and it works, whatever works for you is whatever works. But I personally find that in sessions where someone just keeps it rolling the entire time, then when you actually cut things up and put them together, the file name doesn't tell you what take you're in. It's just some particular segment of a long length of stuff. And if you need to start doing revisions or going back and doing second and third edits, which is usually the case, it can be very hard to figure out where you're at, or what you're changing if you don't have some easily accessible record of what you're using for a given edit. So I find that helps for me a lot. Just trying to build in that level of organization and access to the details of the material, that's kind of inherent in what you're working with.
Yeah, I should mention that I'm super hyper organized, but I was asking for a friend. So
look, going back to when I first started doing this, working at alone in my parents' place, this is all stuff I had to learn the hard way by doing what made sense just as I was going, and then something coming up and biting me because I couldn't figure out, going back and trying to fix something or trying to make a revision. Like, what take was I using there? Oh man, how do I figure? And it just, wasting time trying to reconstruct things or trying to reverse engineer or do investigative work. And it's like, all that time can just be so wasteful or so stressful. So just being defensive about it, by taking a little extra time up front to keep things organized, always label the tracks you make, the when you create a new track, give it a name. Don't just let it be audio 1, audio 2, audio 3. Say that this is, whatever room mics and violin 1 and violin 2 and what mic you're using, or however you want to kind of give you clear information on what it is you're dealing with. That makes such a big difference in the end.
Do we have other questions?
I'm not sure. I just want to quickly say a shout out because I saw his comment earlier to Michael Quick. I'm not sure if he's still here, but hey, Michael, if you are still here, it's great to see you. Michael worked for us a few years ago and was a instrumental part in working through the build out and the opening of our current space here in Mount Vernon. And we had some very intense times running cable through pipes and wiring up patch bays and doing all kinds of things. And he's moved on to do some great things, but it's nice to see his familiar face here. So,
hi, Ryan. Hi, Jess.
Yay. Hey, Michael. Good to see you.
Good to see you guys too.
Thanks for joining. Michael's awesome.
Yeah, he went on to study in Leeds, right?
Yeah,
this is my partner and co-owner of the studio, Jessica Slavin, by the way.
Hi.
So thanks for joining, Jess. All right. Any other questions or?
Can I ask a quick one?
Sure, of course.
So I'm going to be doing some online stuff where I'm playing cello and singing at the same time. So this is not to make like a commercial recording or something. And I'm just looking for a simple setup that I can use, when I'm working with students and just in, Facebook Lives, whatever.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if I could do something like I have the little Bartlett, which is like the DPA, maybe do something like that for the cello and then have like a vocal mic for my voice and just do something very simple because the room sounds, just like through my computer, the room sounds okay. But once we start getting really good mics, we're going to hear, through the windows to Central Park and this and that,
Right.
So I'm trying to keep it simple.
Recording voice and an instrument at the same time is a kind of unique challenge. And I do think actually in that situation, something that's really directional or really tight on the instrument, like a DPA, can be really useful because when you have a vocal mic and the instrument, the bleed between the two can cause pretty weird phase issues.
Right.
And so something that's is for both your voice and for the instrument that's as tight as possible, I think could be helpful. And then maybe also setting up some kind of a room mic to pick up the combination in a natural way and blend that in a little bit can work nicely. But yeah, depending on the vocal mic you're using, also positioning it in a way that you can try to use the position of the mic to reject the sound of the cello a little bit, whether that's kind of putting it low and angling it up so it's kind of facing away from the instrument, as opposed to like down. If you have a mic that's looking at you and at the cello at the same time, then
Right.
then it's like kind of, it's getting you equally. Whereas if it's some kind of directional mic, and this is actually where something like a ribbon mic can be really useful in figure 8, because ribbon mics, because they null 90 degrees off axis, you can find a way to set it up where the cello is, if it's kind of down looking up at you, the cello, and this also works for people who are like singer-songwriter types playing guitar and singing, where you can put the instrument in the null of the mic 90 degrees off axis, and ribbon mics tend to null things out off axis pretty strongly and pretty significantly. So that's
what about a 7B? Would that be
those are
that's
I think,
right.
Yep, that totally. And so I would imagine, I'm not totally sure, not being there, but I would imagine that if you could do something where, the 7B was like kind of low looking up at you and a bit away from, kind of pointing away from the cello, that could be really useful.
Could I even get away with like an SM58 or something like that? Do you think?
Totally.
I know it's not quite the same thing, but
the funny thing is as I understand it, the 57 and the 7B are pretty similar in most ways. It's the same dynamic, it's the same coil, they just have a different transformer. And one of the big differences with the 7B is that it has that structure that kind of makes distance between your face or whatever you're recording and where the element is. And so It's a little easier to kind of blow out a 58 by having it right on your mouth. And
which we've heard in clubs. We've heard everyone do that.
Of course. Of course. So if you're using something like a 58, I would just say that, find a placement for it where you have as direct sound as you want without it having that sound.
Like a pop
7
filter or something.
Yeah, or just having it even just a little bit further away from your mic and not literally like your lips on the grill, you know.
What's the difference between a 57 and a 58? I'm not really clear.
As I understand it, literally just the ball builds in a little extra distance.
That's the 58.
Yeah, whereas it has more pop filtering built into it, whereas a 57 doesn't really have
It's just
that.
flat. Yeah.
It's more made for instruments. Yeah, but they
All
both, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they're pretty much the same mic with a non-electrical difference. Just you could put a pop filter on a 57, and I think it would do essentially the same thing as a 58 would.
And then I would just need like a 2x2 or something to go in for the audience.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And for the 57, if you got it, you know, when you said 2x2, I was thinking a piece of wood, and there's the old joke about hammering nails with the 57. So, you know,
and the cello,
you can start making your acoustic treatment as you record, you know, just ready to go.
Exactly. No, I just meant like a simple audio interface.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Nothing fancy.
Totally.
Thanks.
I think we have one more question in the chat, but before we get to that, I just wanted to mention that we have great workshops coming up. Next Thursday with Ashley Bathgate playing 3 brand new world premieres by Next Fest composers. And we continue with our financial series coming up with Elaine Grogan-Luttrell, and also a couple great sessions with Jason Haheim coming up on deliberate practice, because like Ryan says, when we get into the studio, we need to have done the homework and sound good there. So great. So favorite Altiverb rooms?
I have Altiverb. I haven't used it extensively in a number of years. But when I used to use it a lot, I liked the Teldex scoring stage. I always found kind of nice, and the Mozart Hall. Gosh, but it's been a number of years since I've really been kind of a big user of Altiverb. And I think there's probably lots of new impulse responses for it nowadays. But some of the scoring stages I found pretty cool, and some of the smaller halls I liked. I use mostly I use the Bricasti M7, which is a hardware reverb. And when I'm working from home, which is something I started doing for the first time in a long time over to 2020, I was using Seventh Heaven, which is a kind of plug-in emulator of the Bricasti. And actually, I should say what led me to the Bricasti was using some of the free IRs of the Bricasti for Altiverb, and I found myself using those a lot. So that's another one I would add to the list. Some of I forget who makes them now, but there are a couple different IR libraries that are the Bricasti patches. So the Bricasti is great. It's expensive, but it's amazing for what it does. And I mean, something we use very, very extensively here in the studio. So my brother Jeff just included a link to the Liquid Sonics Seventh Heaven plugin, which is super cool, and for the money does a lot of really great things. But yeah, Altiverb's great as well.
The Bricasti is totally blew my mind.
Yeah.
I've been working with an engineer on it, and it just sounds incredible. Yeah.
I just wish I had two. That's my only complaint about the Bricasti. But I've had the one we have here for like 9 years now, and it's just daily a workhorse. So
yeah. Well, thanks everybody for being here, and thanks so much, Ryan. I mean, this is just so fantastic. You know,
my pleasure. I hope this was helpful, and happy to answer any more questions that anyone has. So just feel free to shoot me emails or whatever, and I'm glad to offer up whatever I can.
And thanks to everybody for being here again. If you want to save the chat, you can go down to the lower right-hand corner of the chat with the 3 dots. Click on that, and it'll give you the option to save it. We'll be archiving this and posting it in a little bit on our YouTube channel, and I'll follow up with everybody on an email so we can all stay in touch. Thanks again, Ryan. This is like really, really super, and we're gonna work together soon. So let's talk about that. So
great.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you next week and the week after and the week after. And stay curious and stay creative and stay inspired and stay healthy. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.